We're just going to start in less than 5 minutes. So welcome to everyone online.
Water doesn't hurt cartilage. Believe me, the first 10 years down anything. Water doesn't hurt cartilage. Trust me. Story on the computer.
Where do you want us?
So you want to go to Julian has I have my case I have to go through. Yeah, you're the most important. You're next to me. I have no problem. Significant dollars. Yeah. Correct. He was stewardship of that. Prince, can I take an end here? Or next to Lisa.
I thought you were here with me.
Watch the chorus. Yeah, this is great for me. Where's the big firestones when I need them? What are you doing? I have a train down there. Go up around the side. I will. But when they put those in the older folks heading to the ark, you should have thought the Rabbi Emeritus trying to get on the bimmer. We got this. Go up on the side. No, don't put it on the Rabbi now. Yeah, Rabbi. You'll trip over that.
Yeah, that thing is unfortunately very unstable.
They want me to get some exercise. Tammy, Shavua Tov. No private phones to the White House during this event. No.
Behind every sign? Yeah.
Sure.
You know who this is? Michael Linden.
Doctor? Women on the right, men on the left. We have a pizza going down the middle here.
As we get started, we're going to be projecting something on the screen there for the people who are here in person. I'm going to encourage you to come to the front so you can see it better. And I think we'll get started. I want to thank our panelists here. We're going to do introductions in just a moment. But first, I want to welcome to the stage Tammy Heps, who's going to give us an introduction to this event and just the whole history of the fire in broad overview. And then we'll get into the details.
Arbel.
That's good because I am not this tall. Okay, hold on, let me get my remarks to. Oh, I would prefer to actually. Okay. So, good morning, everybody. It's nice to see a really nice crowd here in the room where it happened, as well as online. I'm going to start by giving a brief overview to the history before, during, after the fire, just so we're all starting from a shared context of understanding what happened, and also to give our panelists more room to share their particular reflections and not feel like they have to spend too much time narrating the events that happened to then get into the really interesting things that only they can provide insight into. I didn't live in this community then. I'm approaching this from the perspective of a historian who's looked at a lot of old newspaper articles and a lot of ephemera from the synagogue, programs and flyers and shul bulletins and things like that, that allowed me to sort of reconstruct what happened at that time. So let's start by talking a little bit about the history of the building. So this congregation was founded in September of 1917, and in 1922, that's when they broke ground for what has grown into this larger edifice. But the first part that they built is actually the middle portion of the building. So those of us who are in person are here in the portion that's on the right. If you're facing the building, that's our large sanctuary. In the middle is what we have more recently called the community building, although it had other names previously. That was the oldest portion. And then on the left, as you're facing it, you have where the school is and offices are, but that came later. So 1931, High Holidays, was when this part of the building, this big sanctuary space, was first used. And then the old sanctuary, which is the middle building, became at that time an auditorium. The next expansion came in 1970. This sanctuary was expanded more and made even more beautiful. The smaller chapel was built, libraries were added, the school facility that I talked about, youth lounge, gift shop, ballroom, kosher kitchen, all of these different features were added. And the reason why we had all of these different milestones, first building a building in the first place and then expanding it twice, was that the number of Jews in Squirrel Hill in general, and in particular Jews who wished to affiliate with our congregation, kept exploding. And at every moment there were more and more people coming in with more and more diverse needs for a building to accommodate, whether it was educating little kids up through older kids, having a ballroom space for events, having libraries for study, meeting rooms, offices for the growing number of staff people. This building reflects all these different milestones in terms of the community's growth and explosion of energy. And so in 1992, which was the 75th anniversary of the congregation, and just 4 years before the fire, it really was a time of confidence and celebration in the community and a feeling of boundless energy. At that point, the community had known nothing but growth and expansion and foresaw that continuing. But at the same time, across the river, a very different Jewish community was meeting a very different fate, and that is the Homestead Hebrew congregation. And 1992 was the year where they decided to sell their synagogue building, which had been around since 1914, and the congregation itself around since 1894. And that was really the moment where they said, you know what, for decades now we've been getting minyanim by begging and borrowing people, but we simply can't sustain this community anymore. And so a lot of different things happened around the closure of the Homestead Hebrew congregation, but the one that's really relevant to our story today is that because so many Homestead families ended up as members of Beth Shalom, an arrangement was made to transfer a lot of the Judaica and ritual objects from the Homestead congregation into Beth Shalom. And so in particular, they took an existing auditorium and they fitted it up as the Homestead Chapel. They transferred the beautiful wooden ark from the Homestead Synagogue into here. They moved over the War Honor Roll plaques as well as the yard site plaques. The Sifrei Torah were moved over, lots of different Judaica objects. And so that room was used in particular for USY services. Something like 40 kids used this space weekly, and so they were the ones who had the most connection to this particular space in the building. So the fire took place on October 8th, 1996, so just over 25 years ago. A couple people claim to have discovered the fire at the same time, around 2:15 p.m. The head of maintenance discovered it. Where he discovered it was the kitchen on the 4th floor next to the gymnasium. There was also a parent who was here to pick up her kid from preschool who also said when she came in that she smelled smoke and alerted people. It took some time for the news to spread, and initially some of the staff actually thought it was a fire drill and complained that it was a terrible time for a fire drill until somebody explained, actually, no, this is the real deal. The scary thing was that there were 175 people in the building at the time, which included 140 preschoolers and teachers. And so actually they were evacuated by all accounts incredibly quickly, but of course parents were terrified as they were amongst all the people in the neighborhood, saw the smoke coming up and began to get the news of what was going on and knew that their kids had been in the building. The best that I've heard for the cause was defective wiring, but I've never really heard anything definitive. Maybe our panelists can shed some light on that. And people think that the fire had actually smoldered from quite some time before it became detectable. And so basically by the time that the fire was detected, it was actually already going pretty strongly. The firefighters arrived really quickly, but pretty soon the 4th and 5th floors completely collapsed into the 3rd floor, which is where the preschool had been. So thank God those children had been evacuated so quickly because the floors crashed into their space. One of the things that we're going to hear about today, and one of the things that people always talk about the fire, was just how many people rushed into this sanctuary to save the Sifrei Torah that were in this room. The Sifrei Torah that were in the Homestead Hebrew Chapel, that was the heart of the fire, and there was nothing that could be done there. But a human chain was created to get the Sifrei Torah out of this room and onto the street, and that's some of the photographs that we're seeing up on the screen now as we go through. It was members of this community, according to newspaper articles. Yeshiva students came as well to help out with that effort. The fire was so bad, actually, that there were a couple firefighters who were injured, one pretty seriously, and the firefighters considered maybe just letting the fire burn itself out. They thought it was too dangerous to keep on fighting it, and they were just going to have to let it go. And really, it was around 4 p.m. that things finally turned, and they were able to begin to get the fire under control, because if it had gone on much longer as it was, they were just going to have to let it go. They didn't think it was worth what was going to be the human cost of life. By the evening, the fire was largely put out, and members of the congregation gathered outside the building to say evening prayers together. In the following days, ATF officials came to help investigate the cause of the fire, and they were actually very instrumental in trying to find the few remaining fragments of the Torah scrolls in what had been the Homestead Hebrew Chapel. And they actually really understood the urgency of the mission as it was explained to them, and they were sifting through all the rubble desperately trying to find fragments that we could then bury. And I'll talk about that in a moment, but just to sort of survey what the damage was. The center part of the building, which was the oldest part, like I said, the 4th and 5th floors completely collapsed, and 35% of the 3rd floor preschool was burnt up as well, in addition to the rest that had been affected by everything sort of crashing down. In the main sanctuary where we are right now, there was water and smoke damage. That was true for the school wing on the other side. Helfand Chapel was completely underwater. And in the former Homestead Hebrew Chapel, which became one of the centerpieces of the morning after the fire, the Sifrei Torah were completely destroyed. The Ark, which had been brought at great expense from Homestead into this building, was completely destroyed. Yard site plaques with generations of people beloved to the Homestead community were completely melted down, or honor roll plaques that recorded the service of the boys of the community, including my own grandfather. They were destroyed in the fire as well. And so the plaques that you see in the Homestead Hebrew Chapel today were remade and donated by Ed Bayless to the community so that we have reproductions today. So there are a couple of themes that we can already detect in this history. And I have to say, a lot of this research was research that I did years ago, and returning to it in recent months in light of the synagogue shootings, you really begin to see a lot of themes that carried through both incidents in our community. We see communal outreach in both cases. Other buildings, other congregations in this community offered space to us so we could continue activities. New Light became our base of operations for offices and daily services, and Tree of Life was where we had Shabbat services. What is now CDS, what was then JEI, they offered space for the after-school Hebrew classes. And there's stories of leaders and community members from every part of our community, Orthodox, conservative, Reform, what have you, offering what they could to help us keep going. You heard in some of the stories, and we'll hear more of support from law enforcement and public officials. 2 firefighters were injured, but they were determined to try to keep fighting the fire for as much as they could. Even past the moment where they thought that they might have to give up, they kept trying. You also hear about just how extended a community this was. A lot of the kids USY kids who had used this space and then had gone off to college, they were amongst the many people who were really deeply affected by the fire, and in some ways it was almost harder for them because they weren't here with the community to process all of their feelings with the rest of the community. And finally, a lot of the reflections that you see from that time, and I'm sure we'll hear about that today, are the experiences of Jews feeling really confident in a community, but reflecting that usually synagogue fires indicate something quite different. And Lisa, you had a really beautiful comment in the newspaper at that time, I think reflecting back on things like Kristallnacht and looking at the fire that was here and thinking how different it is for us to be in this neighborhood in 1996 experiencing that. So just to go really quickly through the aftermath of the fire, there are three themes that sort of emerged from the different rebuilding efforts. The first one was space. We still needed a building in which to conduct all of our activities. And so the centerpiece of that was the fire rebuilding project, which was a $9 million renovation of this space. It was funded through insurance money and also a significant amount of fundraising from this community, not just to repair the damage that had been done, but also to make this sanctuary even more beautiful than it had been. New ceiling, lighting, chairs, carpeting, upholstery. The bima was refurbished around the original marble Aron Kodesh. And the whole synagogue was grown from what had been 68,000 feet to 88,000 square feet. The second theme that emerges is, of course, around Torah, specifically the Torah fragments that were buried in the Homestead Hebrew Cemetery on December 15th. There was a procession that began in this building that went down to the cemetery in Homestead, combining Beth Shalom as well as Homestead families. And afterwards, everybody returned to this synagogue to immediately introduce the Torah Project Fire Rebuilding Campaign, which was to write a new Torah scroll and dedicate it in a couple years. And so members of this community could dedicate a sedra, a maftir, a chapter, a verse, a word, and everybody contributed to make that project happen. And the last thing that emerges from the rebuilding, of course, is community, not just everybody pulling together in the immediate aftermath, but celebration events that then happened 2 years later to celebrate that this building had been rebuilt and was more magnificent than ever, and that the community had continued on. So there was a big set of events in late October, early November of 1998 called Shulabration 1998. Over Shabbat, we welcomed a Torah scribe and we had a siyum, a Shabbat lunch and learn with the scribe. And then on Sunday, November 1st, there was a siyum haTorah in this very sanctuary to celebrate the new Torah scroll. And then people danced and sang and brought the Torah into the ark of the newly rebuilt Homestead Hebrew Chapel for the next generation of USY teens to be able to use. And throughout the afternoon, there were tours of the new building and an open house. And then there was a celebration dinner dance, which began with a ribbon cutting. At that time, there was something like 1,250 member units in the congregation, so a lot of people participated and turned out. Sorry, my phone is flipping here. Okay, so, and if you look at the cornerstone of this building, you'll see there are a bunch of different dates on it. It starts with 1923, then it says 1930 to 1970, and then it concludes with 1997. And that little cornerstone, I hope now will be a mnemonic for everybody here to look at and remember all of these different moments in the expansion of the community. So I'm just going to end with a few reflections on what all this history, I think, means. First of all, there was a lot of pride at the time for our congregation coming back bigger than better than ever after what had been a really costly setback. It was, of course, incredibly bittersweet for the Homestead Hebrew congregation. Members of that community had taken so much care to preserve their history and keep their legacy going, but man plans and God laughs. That aspect of it went up in flames, but of course everything they donated to the archives survives and permitted me to be able to begin my project some years later. It also, brings up a lot of question marks. This building so perfectly fit our community in the late 1990s when we rebuilt it, but as we look towards the present and the future of our congregation, we once again have questions about what this space ought to be and what our needs are and how the space can best fill them. And I think for myself as the historian looking at all of this and just trying to share my reflections with you, I asked the question about what in this history can give us the courage to face the challenges that we face today at Beth Shalom. The fire we think so much as being about physical loss and rebuilding, But embedded in all of that really is the age-old Jewish determination to continue on. Part of that was dealing with this physical space, but underneath of that was simply we want to keep going as a community, and what's the best way to do that? And so to me, that's the essence of what we can take from this story, not the outward shape that these decisions took. I mean, we're literally sitting in that outward shape, but the determination for us to continue to be in community together, to continue to share a space that provides for all of our needs, and our determination to continue to study Torah together. And so I hope as we hear all of these different stories from people who are actually here and participated in all of that, that we can not only reflect on the very specific things that they did and thought at the time, but again, just thinking more deeply about all of the ways that the things that they did to lead us through the community at that challenging time can inform how all of us reflect on the decisions and the moments that we're in right now in this congregation so that we can continue to be in community together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tammy. Yeah, thank you so much, Tammy. I just, to introduce myself, I'm Chris Hall. I'm the head of Derek, which is our adult education and programming committee here at Beth Shalom. As Tammy said, this was the whole fire, the recovery was a huge recovery effort. I think if we had everyone who was involved in that recovery and was crucial to it, we would not have room on this stage. Like physically, we would have 100 seats on this stage and people would be falling off. But as a small representative of that community, we have 4 excellent panelists. And unfortunately, we were meant to have a 5th, but Harvey Robbins, his wife is recovering from surgery. We wish her refuah shlema, but he cannot be with us today. But I do want to welcome our other 4 panelists. And I'm just going to start at the end and ask you each to introduce yourself and just very, very briefly what your role in the synagogue was 25 years ago.
Is this on? I don't.
Yes.
Okay. I'll put it closer to my mouth. Okay, good. All right, thank you. This is my first time on Zoom, I think. I'm Lisa Steindel, and in 1996, I had been the Rebbitzin of Beth Shalom for 13 years, 10, 12 years, and I had a front row seat, actually, to everything that went on from the moment that I learned of the fire when I was working at Jewish Family and Children's Service, and someone came in and said, I think there's a fire at Beth Shalom, and I ran out of the building on Darlington Street and came up and saw the smoke and stood there. The one quote that Tammy referenced is really one of the 2 things that I would want to be part of the history of this entire event in our congregation's now more than 100-year life. And that was that most of our fellow Jews throughout history, when they saw their synagogue on fire, were fearful. And they were scared about what it meant, and they were scared about who had done it and where they had to go now, where they had to run to. And that was never, ever an issue. From the moment the catastrophe happened, people came forward. I'm sure you're going to hear that we got letters and calls. This was long before the internet, but people heard about it all over the country. And we even had donations sent in from churches that had experienced fires in the South. People all over the country identified with how important it was to rebuild a place of worship, which is in many ways our spiritual home. And the second thing that I would want everybody to remember from the history that I watched, only because in hearing newcomers talk about it, and that was that this was a spectacular building to start. This sanctuary doesn't look a whole lot different than it did. It was, in fact, the color scheme is still the same. And the footprint of this building didn't change. The only thing that changed was that we had a parking lot under our building. And once we decided to build all the way to the ground, I think you bought a couple houses behind us to build a new parking lot. The footprint of the building, so this was a spectacular building to start with, which was what the cry was. And we had also had, as we have today, tenants. In the 90s, we had the JCC's preschool here while the JCC was building. And then for 2 years, we had 2 grades of the community day school that had outgrown their building on Denniston, and before they secured and moved into the building that they're in now. So we had tenants, kids coming in and out. We had our preschool going on, and an everyday in-house religious school. So I think Tammy mentioned 1,200 families. It was a big place with lots going on, but for people who don't remember or weren't here, for the physical building was pretty much the same. We reconfigured a lot of it inside, and that's what these guys are going to tell you about. But those were the two things I would really like to put on the record for history. We were not afraid when this happened. We were afraid about how much money we're going to have to raise, but we weren't afraid what the insurance were. But no one was thinking, oh my God, we've got to move, or we're in danger here. And the other thing was that it was always a beautiful building.
Always a beautiful Rebbitzin. And a great source of support when my days as rabbi of the congregation grew from day and night to all day and all night, most days of the week and endless weeks, in almost a full year of exile for the synagogue, services, programs, and personal highlights, weddings, bar mitzvahs. Only thing that was the same was funerals, right to say. There were no sanctuary funerals in that year. As Rabbi Stephen Steindel of the congregation, I fielded some out-of-town inquiries. I dealt with a lot of personal angst in the life cycle of individual families and simchas. And I tried to be available to the media, who were very, very interested in the visuals. They got a lot of good mileage out of a synagogue in Squirrel Hill on fire, and out of a lot of smoke, and out of a lot of people carrying sidurim and Torah scrolls, as I'm sure Ira will tell us. What I wish to highlight are 3 phone calls that help me regulate and recognize the sequence of the event. Shortly after the fire, it was on a Tuesday, Tammy said, either Wednesday or Thursday, I received a call from the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, then Ismar Shorsh, had been my teacher at Columbia and then at the seminary. And he said, we've heard about the fire. Are you okay? Number 2, is your library okay? He was a scholar. And number 3, was there any suspicious or malfeasance or negative impact? And I was happy to be able to say, I'm okay. Yes, the inside of the building is going to be smoky and wet and probably impenetrable for a while. But most of all, this was an electrical problem. Somewhere in that rebuilt Homestead Hebrew Holy Ark holding the Torahs on the 5th floor, there had been a short and a fire, a lot of smoke going up, a great visual, a lot of water pumped in going down, not so visual, but made everything miserable for a while. That's one phone call. Second phone call was Bob O'Connor, a name that many Pittsburghers will recall with love, a Ger Tzedek, not yet mayor of the city, but an active, visible councilman. Bob O'Connor called to say, yes, he had brokered the deal. Sacred Heart in Shadyside was available, and the preschool could take up residence. Neither Fern nor I can remember exactly how many days in between Exodus and entrance that was, but that led to a year at Lev Kadosh, our preschool at Sacred Heart. And the third call, and I'm glad Mike Tobias walked in, I will never forget the privilege I had to call Mike Tobias, still living on Beechwood, and ask him if he would like, and they would like, if he and Marcia would like Maya's bat mitzvah to be the first such back in our sanctuary. If you know Mike, you know he's not a particularly effusive guy. He doesn't tell you 5 jokes and then slap you on the back. But his excitement, his quick, yes, we would. The invitations are printed, but we'll get the word out. And that Maya bat mitzvah took place back on this bima right before Rosh Hashanah. At the end of that long year of waiting and rebuilding. Love to Maya and her kids.
My name is Julian Elbling. 25 years ago, I was known as the fire president. Let me preface the fire a little bit. I pulled out last night my high holiday speech before the fire. And I looked around this room and I said to everyone, look at the carpet, look at the ceiling, look at the seats. We need a redo here. Well, 3-4 weeks later, we got the redo. My experience was one I will never forget. I got the phone call in my business. I went next door and got Ira. We got Harvey Robbins. And within minutes, the 3 of us were up here. We could see the smoke from downtown Pittsburgh. After we got up here, I was here for a straight 24 hours. It was cold, it was wet. I had my boys from the store bring hooded sweatshirts for all of us to make the night go faster. But I want to tell you how I spent my 3 years. Not on this pulpit, not davening, because you all know that's not me. I started the mornings at 7:30 at Eaton Park in Squirrel Hill with adjusters, contractors, insurance men. That was the beginning of my day. And I probably learned more than I learned 4 years in college, the 1 year of this fire of the rebuilding. I met people from all walks of life, and some of them are still my friends today from Gendico. A few things I can remember that were pivotal points of the fire. The fire chief came up to me and Harvey Robbins while the building was on fire and said, I think we're going to lose the main sanctuary unless the wind turns the other way. Well, God was looking over us. The wind turned the other way. Right. I have a notebook here. I went over last night. I spent over an hour reading all the letters. I even have copies of the checks that we got from the insurance companies. Let me tell you one or two heartbreaking stories I had. Rabbi, the preschool story you told was the truth, but let me add what happened to the preschool. We were offered the Road of Shalom building, and we went over. It would be perfect. No rent. We could move right in. Well, the state and the city went over there, and it didn't pass standards for the infants. At that time, we told Fern Moskoff, everything is taken care of. We have a place to go. Well, I had chest pains because we had no place to go. But as the rabbi said, Bob O'Connor came in, made the deal for Sacred Heart, and we were in within a year. Now, the first couple months, we had to do some work in Sacred Heart. We stopped the building here. We brought Gendico over to the Sacred Heart. They got everything up to speed. And Sandy Zarenberg, Ira, and myself, the week before that school opened, came with buckets of water, and we were washing the lockers and the tables, everything down to get ready. Another recollection that I had that made my heart beat a little faster, look at the ceiling of this building. We had an old acoustical ceiling. We had an old acoustical ceiling that with a paint roller, they could roll it over and we'd be in here. The builders told us to do the job right, we need linear air conditioning, if you see the 2 big strips, and we need a new ceiling. It was $1 million. $1 million didn't bother us, but they said we might not be in for the high holidays. We had a vote of the executive committee. It was tied. I was the vote breaker. Well, my friends told me I turned white, but I voted, put the new ceiling in, and changed the air conditioning system. I can go on for hours and hours with stories about the fire. I'm going to leave here with you tonight all my recollections, checks, absolutely every picture I have for a temporary loan to the shul. But After the last 25 years, like the rabbi said, we have enjoyed not just the sanctuary, but the whole facility up here. And I have to thank numerous people on the fire rebuilding committee. Barry Palkowitz, he was an attorney, Harvey Robinson, attorney. They took care of all the legal items that came about, and there were a lot. Harriet Crewman and Steve Hecht, they were in charge of the flow of the money. And there was a lot of money. We had to raise $2 million in excess what the insurance didn't pay for all of our add-ons. Now, one last story. Harvey Robbins and I went to a donor, and we were told to get $10,000 from him. We went to his business. The fellow, I'm not mentioning names, opened up his checkbook and wrote the check for $10,000 in 2 minutes. We were happy. We brought the check up here, and George Stern, may he rest in peace, said, if he gave you the $10,000 so fast, you didn't do a good job. You should have got another $10,000. So, like I say, I can go on and on and on, and I'm available to anyone who wants to hear some stories, and I'm glad to be here today. Thank you.
So good morning. I think it's still morning. I'm Ira Frank. I was, as Julian said, we had business across the street from each other. At that point, I was a board member of the shul. I was not a member of the executive committee, but he came running into my business. We had eaten lunch together that day, just gotten back from lunch. We were busy at my business, and he ran over and said, grab your keys, let's go, the synagogue's on fire. Now, for those of you that don't know, I was president. There was a little Orthodox still there, but not in the same place, a shul downtown. And I just thought, because he crossed the street, that something was going on in the synagogue downtown. Before I knew it, we were in his car. We picked up Harvey, and the minute we hit the Boulevard of the Allies, you could see the smoke from the beacon in Squirrel Hill from Beth Shalom. We knew we were going to the fire. And as we approached, the police were stopping you. And Harvey Robbins, with his gift of gab, got us, up to in front of the fire engines on Beacon Street. Julian, as he said, went his way. I came up to the front of the sanctuary. It wasn't the Faye Rubenstein yet, but at the front of the sanctuary, people were gathered, already a crowd on the street, and there was commotion about trying to get the Torahs out of this building. This building, being the main sanctuary, was not on fire. There was never any fire in this building, but it was full of smoke. It was a smoke-filled building. Bob O'Connor, his name was mentioned, of blessed memory, but Bob was just a new city councilman at that point, and he knew me because my aunt had worked for his family, and he says, Ira, what can I do to help? I says, we need to get into the building. They had already once tried to get in the building, but the firemen kicked them out and wouldn't let them in the building to get the Torahs out of, you see the metal arc doors behind us. Once the electricity shut off, you can't open them up. I was the only one that knew, along with Billy, the maintenance person, that there's actually a release. I won't tell you where, because God forbid you come in and you take them. But when the power is off, there is a release that you can get in. Billy, in the dark with the firemen, there were 4 firemen that, there were 4 of us that were allowed in the building. Bob O'Connor got the fire chief, captain, whatever he was, to let us in. The fire person, it was Rabbi Yair at that point, myself, Billy, that came into the building. Billy got the ark open, and we started removing the 20-some Torahs that we had in the ark at that time. I was in shipping, I wasn't in receiving. I'm told that they were taken down these stairs and taken over to a couple of different families across the street for safekeeping. I don't know that for a fact. I was in shipping. We got all the Torahs out of the building, and then the fire captain, chief, whatever, said, let's go, you got to get out of the building. And I says, well, we have to see what's going on next door, because there's Torahs in there, and there's other books that we have to get out. And we walked in. We're on the 3rd floor of it's not always the same floor. We went up into the gym. At that point, we could see the gym, the 4th floor. The Homestead Ark, it wasn't the Homestead Hebrew yet. That didn't exist till after the fire. But it was the Homestead Ark was in there. We could see the fire. There were flames going. And I could see that there was at least, I don't know, I might be exaggerating a little bit, but above my ankles of water on that floor. And I'm not an engineer, but I know that if water goes down, it doesn't go up. So at that point, all of our records, all of our business was in that building. So all of the cemetery records, all of our prayer books, anything that existed in the daily services and cemetery records, nothing was computerized, were in that building. So I was going through and just anything that I could grab and sending it out of the building. And the fire chief captain, whatever he was, kept telling me, you're going to jail. You got to get out of the building. I said, I'll go to jail, but one more room. And we worked our way around the building. And, those that know, Ira and I have asthma and can't breathe, and it wasn't very easy breathing in the building, but we didn't worry about it. We got stuff out of the building, all of the records, all of the books, all of the cemetery records. We got everything out of the building because they were going to be soaked when it came through. And we got, we weren't involved in any of the politics. That was a different committee. I was involved in this. When Julian was in here, one last story, when Julian was in here and doing the politics of trying to deal with stuff, I was outside. I had been assigned to be outside the building and not let anybody in. The roof had collapsed. The fourth floor was still the floor. That's the third floor. The fourth floor roof of the gym was intact, but it was full of water, and the air conditioning roof units were on the roof, multi-ton units on the roof that could have collapsed and taken down the building. While I was outside that evening, I remember one woman, I don't know who she was, but one preschool mother that came up here and insisted that she had to go in and get her kid's favorite stuffed toy because the kid wouldn't fall asleep without the stuffed toy. I says, go to Kmart and buy a new toy. You're going to get killed if that comes down. You don't need that. And Abe Salem, of blessed memory, needed his toaster because he needed to make toast the next morning. And he insisted that he had to come in here and get the toaster. Julian saw him at that point and says, we'll buy you a new toaster. You're not going in the building. But we almost had to tackle Abe Salem and not let him in the building because he insisted that he had to get in to get the toaster because we didn't have a building, but he was going to serve breakfast the next morning because that's the priority. And I'll wait for you to ask me the other questions before I tell on. I could go on for much more time, but we want to get out of here before the Steeler game.
That's what's really important. Can we play the first video? This will give us some visuals of the fire and just some people involved in the fire.
I didn't share screen.
We ordered that for effect. There we go.
Thanks, Rabbi.
On October 8th at 2 o'clock, one of the parents ran into my office yelling that there was a fire in the ceiling of the community building. My heart raced. I picked up the phone and dialed 911, and there it all began.
Fire destroyed decades of memories. The blaze takes a Jewish community's place of worship and study, but faith is not destroyed.
Tonight, hundreds of people are trying to deal with that devastation after watching their place of worship go up in smoke.
Flames started shooting out of the synagogue this afternoon while dozens of children were still inside. It happened at the Beth Shalom Synagogue, Beacon Avenue in Squirrel Hill.
There was just no way to describe the amount of damage.
Almost 100 preschoolers were inside at the time. We're talking about 2-, 3-, and 4-year-old children, kids who made it out without being hurt, but left behind their school memories, smoke and water damaged.
My 5-year-old son, Adam, who was 4 at the time, was at preschool on that fateful day. I distinctly remember the phone call I received telling me that Beth Shalom was on fire. I was stunned and quite frightened until I was reassured that all the children were out of the building and perfectly safe. Beth Shalom preschool staff, under the direction of Fern Moskoff, led our 120 children out of the building in an orderly, quick, and safe manner. It was truly a remarkable feat, considering the ages of the children.
Flames shot out of the roof of the education building. Thick black smoke could be seen for miles. Hundreds watched in horror as their place of worship went up in flames.
I ran out and saw my synagogue is on flames, and I've been here my whole entire life.
And you will be here, and it's going to be here your whole life. We're going to smile.
I've never
we're
seen
going
a
to thank
fire
God
like
again.
this in my life. I remember the Beth Shalom fire as if it were yesterday. I remember running up Shady Avenue, smelling the smoke, seeing everyone crazy, crying. The images that come to me make me want to cry again. Yet the reason that I don't cry is because no life was actually lost in this fire. And Beth Shalom is going to be a better place now.
My name is Moshe Taube, and I am the cantor of the synagogue and the congregation Beth Shalom. I am a survivor of the Holocaust and a survivor of the Schindler's List. And you would say that I'm used to tragedies, surviving all kinds of misfortunes. And you would think that the fire at Beth Shalom would not affect me deeply, since I am so well experienced in tragedies and misfortunes. No. The fire, when I saw it, when I saw the flames shooting up into the sky, traumatized me very, very deeply. I saw it as another tragedy in my own life, and of course the life of my beloved Beth Shalom.
Especially for the technical flipping back and forth. And I just want, especially the people online, to know we have these videos. We can make them available online after this event. They're pretty remarkable to see all the voices of the people who were there and involved. But for the moment, Julian, I want to ask you to just bring yourself back to 4 p.m., 5 p.m. that day. And just, can you tell me a bit about what was going through your mind? What were the feelings of seeing the building in flames?
We had quick reactions. We never missed a minion. The next morning, I called Barbara Kaplan up at New Light, and she says, "You're welcome here." We had a computer set up at New Light. But my first thing thinking in my mind, we had bar mitzvahs, we had weddings, all kind of things scheduled for the building. I had to take care of. We went to Temple Sinai for a wedding. We went to Tree of Life. We went to the JCC. But we didn't miss a beat. And thankfully, with my committee and the rabbis and the cantor, we have moved the choir. The choir went from spot to spot, and they sang. So we were so lucky to have dedicated members at that time, and we still have them today. But that's what went through my mind at 4 o'clock. What's going to happen tomorrow? And tomorrow came, and we were fine.
Thank you. And Rabbi Steindel, we just saw you, I think you were just out of frame with your arm around Dina Stein. The emotion going through that crowd must have been stunning. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that.
I remember Dina in particular, as president of USY that year and super involved, felt a very personal angst as some of the others got involved and I think exercised their frustration and fear by helping carry out books for hours and hours at a time. Dina organized a mincha on the sidewalk that was held that same afternoon right in front of the sanctuary entrance. And I believe, as we've heard so often from Rabbi Adelson in recent years, prayer doesn't hurt and it quite possibly helps. Davening in the face of a crisis brings an outlet. As I thought of the events coming to this event, Julian is absolutely correct. With Amir Pilch's behind the scenes, but super attentive to detail as an executive director par excellence, we moved among several bases. The office and the Daily Minyan was immediately at New Light. The Friday night service, which had traditionally been at 7:30 p.m. in our Helfon Chapel, was a little late for their weekly service of 8 p.m., so it moved back to 7, where it remained for years thereafter. We went to venues for the Shabbat morning service, most of which were either the large or the smaller sanctuary at Tree of Life. Now, of course, Tree of Life got much more famous 20 years later, unfortunately. But we were in that building, I would say, for 95% of the Sabbath mornings, depending on what their schedule allowed and what our schedule needed, in either in their main sanctuary or in their side or smaller sanctuary. In either case, when you came in, you got to see the choir practicing, rehearsing behind glass, a privilege they never had here. But they were going to rehearse because Kenneth Taube wanted them ready for his service. The style of his service did not change one iota as the building around it changed. And then lastly, I would like to highlight that Amir's perspective, even while the insurance and the rebuilding and the Torah project details were proceeding, was to keep the daily contact of the synagogue office with our membership warm and alive. People came in and out of New Light Synagogue. It may have not been comfortable, but they knew how to find and how to be heard throughout that year.
And
let me just add
please,
that we ended up with 2 Sfarim, 2 Torahs on our dining room table that night. And my husband was very, very uncomfortable. They were covered by telesim, but he wouldn't let any of us speak loudly. We couldn't talk loud while we were anywhere near the dining room where they were. I couldn't swear. And I remember calling a girlfriend and saying, "This can't last. we got to find a place for these Torahs because my house can't be this good."
Well, I have to ask that, Lisa.
Sherry, what do you remember?
Where did those Torahs end up then?
So a couple of, I don't know if it was days later or a week later, but all the Torahs that were housed, and I don't know where, because like I said, I was in shipping, not receiving, but they ended up down in the synagogue downtown in Ark because we had a second floor at that point that wasn't used. So I don't remember if one was kept for like the bar mitzvahs. I believe we kept one that we moved with us so that the bat mitzvah kids had a familiar Torah, and that was the Beth Shalom Torah, as we were nomads for the year. But the rest of them were in the Ark and in safekeeping in the synagogue downtown. Now, I want to say, just about how we got the preschool. They mentioned about the preschool. So I remember, and I mentioned this to Julian this morning. He didn't really remember it all, but we were eating lunch at Willis Kaufman's, and as we were walking back to our businesses, and he said he had to get back because he had to call Bob O'Connor about the preschool. It must have been the day after, or the second day after the fire. And we were right outside City Hall because we walked by there on the way. And I says, "Why are you going to go back and call?" Naive little 30-year-old me said, "Let's just go up the elevator and see them." So we went up the elevator. We're dressed as workers, not even as nice as we are today, and got off the elevator. And the young lady who was the secretary, the gatekeeper, doing her job that she was told to do to not let anybody in because anyone off the street just doesn't get in and say, "I want to see the city councilman." They're not available. They're not available. Well, one of the other city councilmen got off the elevator, Dan Cohen, I believe was his name, who got off the elevator and said, "Hello, Ira, what are you doing here?" And I said, "We're trying to see Bob." And now this lady for 5 minutes had been telling us that Bob O'Connor wasn't in the building and wasn't available. And Dan said, "Oh, he's back in his office. Come on, let's go see him." And you just saw the utter disgust on this poor woman's face who was doing her job as she had been taught and as she's supposed to. And we went back to Bob. And Julian, I don't know if you remember this, but you told him the story about what you needed. I didn't know what we were even there for. And what was the public school? I'm not great at names. I knew it a minute ago, but the director, the superintendent of public schools, Dan called up and said to the public schools and said, I want to talk to whatever her name was. And his response was, "Well, she's in a meeting." And he says, "Well, get her out of the meeting. I have to ask her a question." And her question was, "Are you using the building?" She said no. And he says, "Okay, Beth Shalom is." And that was the day that the decision was made. I think it took the lawyers 2 years to get the paperwork set up. We were in and out before the lease was signed. But, it was great friends. The stress is that there were great friends in the community. And I think the record really needs to show that if we were not in the city, if we didn't have professional, even back then, the professional firefighters, the professional ambulance, I think in my estimation, it was around 100 different vehicles from city. It wasn't public service back then, between fire, ambulance, whatever. There were here people that really risked their lives to come into a synagogue to save it, as Lisa or Rabbi said, as opposed to in the old days when you were afraid of them, that they risked their lives, once again, to save our building. And if it wasn't a synagogue, they would have let it burn.
Thank you. So Lisa, you had mentioned earlier that there were letters that came in from across the country. I wonder if you can tell us a bit more about that upswell of just reactions to the synagogue fire burning outside of our community.
Unfortunately, we've all more closely now lived through the October 27th massacre and catastrophe, and that brought a lot of memories to the surface, because it wasn't exactly the same. Thank God, it wasn't the same, but that kind of sense that we all felt on October 28th and November 1st, and for the next year, of the community coming forward and nationally, and people coming forward and offering support and condolences was really quite similar. Rabbis from all over the country, of course, called. Anybody we had gone to Camp Ramah with 20 years earlier called. And non-Jews were really quite loving and forward coming to try to condole us and to give us hope. And what I'm proud of is that I think that following that, the administration of this synagogue, of Beth Shalom and Julian and Ira and the presidents in between them and that followed, reached out and did the same thing, as we learned later, years later, of other houses of worship, that whether it was a mosque or a church that burned and that went through a similar situation.
Thank you. I mean, just my own personal reflection, I was in a board meeting 3 years ago after the shooting, when I know Ira stood up and said, we have a responsibility here, not just as Jews, not just ordinarily, but because of our personal experience in the synagogue. And that was very meaningful. Rabbi Steindel, Can you reflect a little? We heard that the homestead Sifrei Torahs burned, unfortunately. Can you reflect a little about what that meant to the community and the process of burying them?
Well, that was a sub-theme, of course. Everyone talked about Beth Shalom burned. The Torahs were rescued. But the Torahs, as in any synagogue, have a long history. They didn't all come at once. They were contributed, purchased, gathered. After the Holocaust, there was a whole new generation of Torah scrolls that became the parts of the museums and the living congregations of the Western world. Homestead Hebrew congregation, and we have an expert sitting here with us, so at some point Tammy has to either correct me or take over. Homestead Hebrew congregation had a long and beautiful history serving the community of what we call Homestead. And there are many members of this congregation who are second, third, fourth generation connections. Who are you pointing to? Skip Grinberg, parents, an uncle. Absolutely. They saw diminished numbers, diminished days. Their building was sold to a church, and their Torah scrolls were distributed, as is often the case in Western Pennsylvania and elsewhere, to different synagogues who might need it. All here? Thank you. Some go to Hillel, some go to new shuls, some go to startups. All those scrolls came here. Tammy, how many? 5. Oh, 5 or 6. Well, that's like a mother says, my kids are in there. How many? 5 or 6. Send the firemen back in. It might be 6. Okay. The scrolls were brought here with 2 intents: to keep them alive in a Jewish ritual sense, and to create the Homestead Hebrew Chapel, which would bring the wood that used to be here until 1970 to the upstairs, and put, I think, 2 of the scrolls or 4 of the scrolls up there in the gym. The Homestead Hebrew rebuilt. And past President David Rosenblum of Lava Shalom physically led that. Great talent, not only in a meeting, but with his hands. He did rebuild, took it apart, rebuilt it here with help. So what burned was that chapel. How many Torahs were in that chapel at that time? Do we know? I'm going to guess 2, but I don't know, because a couple would have been here. And then we had and then we had the Daily Minyan Chapel, and then we had the USY Chapel, and then we had the Helfon Chapel. And if Rosh Chodesh was coming, we needed 2 or 3 Torahs. Okay, so Torahs were everywhere. Torahs are a poppin', like toys are poppin'. The emotional connection was the assumption, or I believe even the scientific knowledge, because of the way Torah scrolls can now be marked, unfortunately for reasons of theft and resale. Torah scrolls are required by insurance to be identified, coded on the Eitz Chaim, so that if it's resold somewhere, you know which one you lost and how much it might be worth in replenishment. Of the scrolls that were beyond synagogue use, 2 were worthy of burial. And the assumption was, and the most appropriate place, was the burial in Homestead Hebrew Cemetery, from whence they had come on this round robin. And that is the history of what you see with David Rayev, alav shalom, personally involved, and an amazing cavalcade of cars over the Homestead High-Level Bridge, bringing the remnants of the 2 scrolls to a very special central matzeva in the midst of Homestead Hebrew, which I guess beside Tammy, not too many of us get to, but it's there. It awaits your visit. Maybe in commemoration with this, we can do something collective and go back and say Kaddish. And that's what we did that day with the 2 scrolls that deserve to be buried. Reminding you and anyone listening that a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll, is never treated with any less respect than a deceased member of the Jewish people. Brought to burial with love, with respect, and with eternal home.
Thank you, Rabbi. Julian, I'm wondering if you can reflect on the process of rebuilding. I know that's a huge topic, but just how did it even start? After that first week, you looked up and down and you said, all right, what's next?
Well, we formulated a committee. We met on the 2nd floor of New Light in one of their meeting rooms. We almost had a fist fight from 2 past presidents. Rabbi Chuck at the time had to break up the fist fight, but it was very emotional. But as I said before, we had subcommittees, committees. Everyone did their thing, and we had to put politics aside. Now, putting politics aside, I want to lay one thing straight for everyone here and everyone watching Zoom. I still get to this day complaints about the chairs in this room. Now, there's a story behind that. The committee had all kind of chairs, and we sat and we wiggled around in the chairs. One was more comfortable than the next. We picked the colors. Then when the chairs were installed, it wasn't the chair that we picked. Here the city came in, and they took our center aisle, which was narrower before, and says, you need so many extra feet, and the only way we could get the feet is to cut the size of the chairs down. And at that point, when we had 1,200 families, every seat was taken for the holidays. So the committees basically didn't know what happened. The seats were installed, and then we resat in the seats and says, this isn't the same seat that we agreed upon. So it was committee upon committee, whether it was for seats for the sanctuary, carpet, picking colors. That's what made everything click. And I just want to bring one other thing up. Moving the preschool, that was a committee also. We had to stop all building here. The construction company was Gendico Construction. We told them more important than this building was the preschool. Preschool, the state law was if you had infants, had to have easy access in and out. They actually had to build staircases to get these little kids out. So we stopped all the building here, and the preschool committee says, this is what we need, and we got it done for them. But it was all committees, it was all our volunteers, Amir Pilch, the rabbi, everyone, we worked together. I remember laying on my back in the rabbi's office one day. He didn't like the desk we picked. Do you remember that, Rabbi? The ceiling. And we got it straightened out. And I want to tell you one more story about our good rabbi and how the committees worked. His son was being bar mitzvahed. The building was semi-open. The main sanctuary wasn't open. But if you remember, the ballroom was open. And they have very few friends, the rabbi, so they only had about 300 people here for the bar mitzvah. And I says, Rabbi, we can't do it. You can't have a sanctuary in the ballroom and then serve lunch for everyone. He says, that's what I want. So that's what we said. All right, that's what. So I got Ira and all my friends. I says, we can do it. The service was over. We all had work clothes on. We stripped down the ballroom as a sanctuary. You remember, Lisa? And we put the round tables up, and lunch was served to everyone. Now, the rabbi might want to correct something I'm saying here.
Yesterday, when we honored Lonnie, who had something to do with the chairs, or at least fitting us into the chairs after they were permanent seats, Sheila Levine comes over to me. Sheila Levine's mother comes over to me and says, remember Sheila's wedding? February 15th, 1997, as scheduled in this room, in the Samuel and Minnie Hyman Ballroom. The chuppah here, all the tables double-decker, everyone asked to go out for hors d'oeuvres, 30 minutes to turn around the room, and the model for the Avi Steindel bar mitzvah 3 months later.
Let me add one thing. All of this was with porta potties. Porta potties. We're not, I mean, the plumbing isn't working. right? It's a very, and the other thing, just for historical perspective, when Ira talked about running in to get all the cemetery records, none of that was on computers. You're talking about sheets of paper and rolls. Well, no, it is now. Historically, in generations to come, it'll be very hard to remember a time when all of this was in real paper and real people's minds, and it was really, that made the task even more important to do. There was no cloud.
Thank you.
One last
please.
thing about the chairs. After the chairs were installed, the pews here, and there were complaints, we never paid for them. There was an anonymous donor paid for this. Never had a bill for the seats.
Who was that?
Can't tell.
The middle aisle, which was so important for weddings, especially, as well as crowd control, had two important impacts. Number one, you could never again have candles burning for a bride's procession. You could have all kind of make-believes, batteries, you name it, but you could not again, and Amir had to fight that battle with families who waited to have their simcha in this sanctuary. Second is that it had to be 6 feet wide. And 23 years later, we all learned to live with 6 feet social distance, pioneered at Beth Shalom.
I want to add one last comment also. You asked me, what did I do at 4 o'clock when I came up here? I came up at 4 o'clock. Water was running down the steps. We had to shore up the building. There was a construction company called Rashuti Construction with no contracts, didn't have to ask them. They were here. And it had not been for them, we would have had water damage beyond repair. So they just came on their own accord. They were friends with members of the congregation and did what had to be done.
So one other comment just on that. So the next day, I came here. You talk about people. Jimmy Cohen, who had children in the preschool, I believe at that time, who's plumber par excellence, but he was here, and the two of us went up to the second floor. Tammy, you mentioned ATF being in the building. I vividly remember being up on the second floor the day after the fire. ATF in full fire gear were up there and sifting through the remains. And as they were sifting through it, Jimmy and I were going around seeing if he could turn water on to get water into the building, which he couldn't because the water had cracked. But the ATF workers moved something and flames started. Now they were in full fire gear. Jimmy and I were in street clothes, and they turned to us and said, "Call the fire department, the fire's going again." I'm like, "You're the firefighters." They're saying, "No, we're investigators. We're not firefighters." So we picked up, there was a fire, the fire hoses had just been left. The firemen were so exhausted the night before when they left, they didn't clean up. Many of the hoses and our own standpipes were just intermixed all over the place. So we picked up and started fighting the fire in our street clothes while the ATF were in their fire gear, waiting for the fire department to come back in until the real firemen came and kicked the two of us out and had to bring new wires in because the hoses were no good. So, yes, as was said, I mean, it was a lot of memories, and everyone remembers it slightly differently and from a different angle. But the community came together, the world came together, and again, I think, no one really mentioned how many other congregations, non-Jewish, came together. I remember being told afterwards how many people helped in carrying the Torahs. Again, I was not there, I was inside, but we had professional clergy from almost every religion around Squirrel Hill here helping. And at that point, we were not egalitarian completely, but nobody cared whether it was a woman carrying the Torah, a man carrying the Torah, Yamuki on, Yamuki off, Jewish, not Jewish, bar mitzvah, not bar mitzvah. Everyone's concern was saving the Torahs and saving, of course, life had already been saved because the kids were out before we got here. So we were saving the building and saving the sacred Torahs. And like I said, all of those records. I mean, the people that were, they weren't in the fire, but they were at the door taking stuff out, were of all denominations, of every shape, flavor, and variety that were here, helping us and risking their lives to some extent to get all those records, those invaluable records, out of the building. So historians like Tammy can read through them.
So we just have time for one more question. I'm going to ask it for each member of the panel. I'll start with Ira, and just ask you to remember that we're near time. But can you just reflect on the last 25 years, how the synagogue has changed because of the fire? And of course, I don't just mean the physical building, I mean who we are as a congregation.
I never like to go first. Obviously, the structure changed. We put a lot of time, effort, and energy into rebuilding, redesigning, and making the building set for what we had at the time. Any decision that's made in retrospect, when you look back, some are made right and some are made wrong. Some of you guessed right and some of you guessed wrong. Was it the right size, the right color, the right carpet, the right seats? We've got at least one other past president here with us, Judy, who was involved, Judy Cobell. And Harvey, at least I know, is on because he's called twice with comments. But there's probably other past presidents. Everyone was involved. Everyone worked together. And we came to a building that met the needs at that time, and we tried to have it for the future. I truly remember being at a board meeting shortly thereafter when all these plans and all the expense, and there were a few of us that raised our hands and said, for the record, we have to ask, do we want to stay in Squirrel Hill? Is this the opportunity to leave? Do we want to leave Squirrel Hill? Just for the record. And of course, unanimously was that Squirrel Hill will remain to be our home and will remain to be the center of Jewish life. And there we were right. We may not be as big a Jewish community in Squirrel Hill as we were at that point, but we're still the community and we're still the premier congregation in the Western Pennsylvania. Beth Shalom is the place where people want to be because we made a lot of right decisions. Not all right decisions, but most right decisions on how we did things. Our preschool has thrived in the building we built for them. The gymnasium that we built, the Rice Youth Auditorium, has not missed a beat of having activity. So I think we have ways of all coming together for meetings, rental this, rental in, this, rental out. Politics, we're on the inside, we're outside. But generally speaking, as Lisa said, the Tree of Life tragedy unfortunately brought us, together again as a community where we work together. But unfortunately, sometimes through tragedy is when where you see where your strengths were. So I think we shined.
Did we have a crystal ball 25 years ago? No. But we built the building 25 years ago for the needs of 25 years ago. So we can't be a fifth quarter quarterback and say, well, we didn't need the sanctuary. At that time, we did. So my reflections are, for the time when we rebuilt the synagogue, we did 100% the correct job. Do we have to tweak it maybe today? Well, today maybe it should be tweaked if we'd have the money and the means to tweak it. So we're still here. We're still, like Ira said, the strongest synagogue in Western Pennsylvania, and I'm proud to be here.
I think emotionally, the immediate impact of the fire and being away was the need to get back. The emotional sense of back home. I want to be back in my house. I want to be back in my TV room equivalent, the way it was. And that impacted the thoughts and the decisions and maybe even the rational discourse that might have squeezed its way in. The idea of bringing this great congregation back into this sanctuary for the high holidays was paramount. No one was willing to give up on that for anything. These seats, if you remember, were all here. There was no opening. There was no service from the floor. Everything was on the bimah. The only people who objected to any change were the people whose seats were taken away because they wanted to sit where their parents and grandparents used to sit for the service, as interesting or as boring as it was. That's what they knew as Beth Shalom. And at some point, I hope Rabbi Sugarman will help us, and a larger group of us, get together and look at all the plaques that are behind the Israeli flag, fewer elsewhere, on the marble structures and around the building and the windows, to show the names and the legacies of what had made this a unique and special, unforgettable spiritual home. So get back in, be there, back home, comfortable, the old slippers on my feet. I think that was the paramount emotional goal. Now we have no religious school. Now we have a preschool that's winning awards, but a great day school in a former Catholic church. Speaking of facing change, is Squirrel Hill the right place? Absolutely. I think it would have been a very negative decision to go to Upper St. Clair or Fox Chapel or wherever else land might have been available. And I thank Lisa for the last word.
I want to remember the question, which was, yes, 25 years. So 25 years, and the changes that have taken place. I think that anybody who's ever lived with a front row seat like I had to a catastrophe is changed by that. And I can tell you that the way that it changed me was to appreciate all the things that all of us take for granted. The nature of a community like Beth Shalom's, the nature of a spectacular building. And this building was built at a time when synagogues were, people gave money to build gorgeous buildings and lived in modest homes. Now you go out to suburbia and you have modest synagogues and spectacular McMansions. It's a different generation. I think that in those 25 years, I've focused on not taking for granted what it means to have community. You know, when I was young, I thought it meant everybody liked each other. That's not what it means at all. Your community, your shtetl here, may be somebody who doesn't even talk to you, but they still are your village. And I think that almost losing a place like this makes you appreciate having it and making sure, working hard, that you don't quite ever lose it, and that maybe you can hand off the opportunity to your children to connect and have such a place. So over the 25 years, I think we can be proud of what happened. In the rebuilding, one of my absolute favorite moments was when Judy Kornblith then was chairing the refurbishing of this building, and we came in here and the whole building was scaffolding, and I can tell you, as I've told my grandchildren, that we all got to walk up and touch the crown because we were on this scaffolding that could, and the idea of being in this building where we've had, 3 daughters married is very, very special. I sat for 10 years and looked at the engraving on that podium. It took me 10 years to figure out what it is. For a long time, I thought it was scales. It's not. If you look at it long enough, you'll catch it. I should tell you, it's an open book with candlesticks in front of it. But it took me 10 years of sitting in the front rows here to figure out that that's what that is. It's a spectacular sight, and we would hope that no matter what people decide to do with the configuration of the seating, that we can hand off this spectacular edifice and watch our grandchildren married here too.
Thank you. I promised Ira one short last word.
Silly you. Anyways, what Lisa said, and I'm sitting here looking at her grandchildren, and I had to bring something up. Because over 25 years, I've seen a lot of what your youngsters are now peers and are now friends grow up through this building. But what remains the same is the 13-year-olds are still the 13-year-olds. The 18-year-olds are still the 18-year-olds, and the 5-year-olds in preschool are still the 5-year-olds in preschool. The faces have changed, but they're the exact same people. And this building remains their home. And there's where I think we did right. We may not be perfect. We may not have done everything right, but I think when I see all of the families and all of the kids that come and call Beth Shalom home. This is home to them. And this is where they're comfortable running around and playing. That's how I know that we are a community.
Yeah, well, one note I must say for history. Among those bat mitzvah in the year we were out of this building was a young lady who was then able to become a national celebrity by what she announced in the aftermath of the Tree of Life tragedy. Lou and Amy Weiss were and are members of this congregation. They raised their kids in our shul and our CDS. The bat mitzvah of Barry Weiss was scheduled for the year of the fire. Only because of this circumstance did that event take place at Tree of Life. But with an editing that historians will probably miss. And here I'll go back to Dr. Ismar Schorsch. How does an historian make it correct? She was able to publish a book and become a national figure on media and on Larry David's show by saying, I was bat mitzvah at Tree of Life, with no asterisk.
Well, I want to take a last moment to look at the last video we have that celebrates the recovery from the fire.
A lot of buttons.
In conversation with our executive director, Mayor Pilch, throughout a period of approximately a year and a half, in discussing doing a Torah project here at Beth Shalom, I cannot begin to express what it feels like for the congregation to have the opportunity to not only study Torah through the educational process, but to strengthen our congregation and community through the Torah project.
I'm Harriet Crewman. I'm a past president of Congregation Beth Shalom, and together with Steve Hecht, I'm co-chairing our new Torah project. In Deuteronomy, we're commanded to scribe a Sefer Torah, but most of us don't really have the necessary skills to accomplish this. So we have hired an Israeli scribe and have commissioned him to scribe the Torah, and this will provide us with a unique opportunity to fulfill the 613th commandment.
My name is Milton Eisner, and I'm a past president of Congregation Beth Shalom from 1985 through 1988. I've been asked to be the chairman of the fundraising program to rebuild Beth Shalom. My only hope is that the congregation will see the future as I see the future and will be donating to their utmost ability. I am privileged to chair this committee, and hopefully we will raise the money we needed to rebuild Beth Shalom.
Torah scrolls to the whites of the high holidays and placing on the first Torah this wimple, Hodu Ladonai Ki Tov, Ki Leolam Chasto. From that day of the fire to this day of return, we give thanks unto the Lord for his mercy. We are thankful for safety and renewal and return as a living house of God, our Beth Shalom, our house of peace.
This project has been a long and tiring project, but as you can see from the scenes behind me, the project is coming along well. Beth Shalom will stand as an institution that will last continued generations
and offer the high level of excellence which we all have been accustomed to for future generations.
Many people are responsible for our new refurbished facility that you see here this evening. The three men who I've worked so closely with are the co-chairmen of the core committee. They are George Stern, Jules Crewman, and Barry J. Palkowitz, Esquire. Let's give them a special round of applause. The two most capable women, Marlene Silverman and Bernice Myers, made this evening happen. Without the fundraising efforts of Milton Eisner and Arnold H. Lazarus, we could not rebuild this marvelous, magnificent edifice. I wish the entire membership, staff, clergy, and friends a hearty welcome and muzzle.
This video, these two videos that we've showed are part of a much longer video compilation that the synagogue put together very foresightedly 25 years ago as a way of recording our synagogue's history. We are making a similar effort now, actually. There is a site that we have set up where anyone who has memories of the fire can go and record their recollections. The links to that are in the constant contact communication that you've received from the shul over the last couple weeks. So I really encourage people who are here in the building, people who are online, to take a moment. If you do remember the fire, here with our panelists today, we've learned things, right, that we never knew. The Sefer Torahs on Lisa Steindel's dining room table that we have to be very quiet around. A dozen other stories as well. This is our history, and if you have some part of it in your mind, I would encourage you to write it down in this on the site that we've set up. I want to thank, of course, our panelists, Lisa Steindel, Rabbi Steindel, Julian Elbling, Ira Frank. Your contributions to the synagogue and to our panel are immeasurable, and thank you. Thank you as well to everyone else who could not be on the stage. As I said, it's more people that can fit on the stage. And especially to Harvey Robbins, who, as I mentioned, can't be here today. We wish refuah shlema to his wife. I want to thank our event organizers, Tammy Heps, Boaz Frankel, Rabbi Sugarman, Rabbi Goodman, Executive Director Robert Lieberman, and the whole synagogue staff. And again, special thanks to everyone who's involved in the synagogue, in the recovery of the synagogue. We saw some of their faces on stage, some of their faces in the videos. There are more people than I know and that I can thank. And look, I joined the synagogue 8 years ago. I could not have been a part of this synagogue without the efforts of everyone who came before me. So thank you. And have a good day.
Ira, steal is what time? Thank you. The Michigan game.